Hey everybody, we're back at my place. Forrest is busy this week, so we're going to talk about the bans that just happened and also the design philosophy that has kind of led to where we currently are with Magic the Gathering.
Distraction makers.
Most of you already know that there's been a few bans in Magic recently. In Standard, they banned Vivi, Eidetic Memory, Screaming Nemesis, and in Legacy, they banned Entomb and Nadu. There's also been some other stuff banned in a few other formats, but that I don't think is relevant to the thing that I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about is the design philosophy, at least in my perception, that has led us to the point that we were at in Magic the Gathering, where many of the competitive formats are not having a great time. Modern seems to be doing okay, but Standard and Legacy both are hurting a bit. What is the design philosophy that I'm talking about? Previously, Wizards R&D had discussed what they called fire design, and they sort of used that framework to say that we need to make cards that players are excited to play. I think we need to have a little bit of understanding for the position that they were in at the time when they decided to enact fire design. Why would they make that decision? If everything was going swimmingly, they probably just would have stayed where they were and they wouldn't have changed anything. These sort of competitive formats, I think, had already started to see some amount of decline. When we look at the current era, I think it's fair to call it fire hose design. The amount of cards that are being printed are at such a pace, there's such a deluge of cards that I think it's very difficult for Wizards R&D to keep up with. And I think that what has happened is that it's shifted their design ethos from being a proactive one to being a reactive design philosophy. We tend to see this from card games that have smaller teams or smaller budgets because they just don't have the resources to stay ahead of whatever it is they're doing. Or we see it from card games that have eternal formats where the ability for them to test the totality of what might emerge in the format is basically impossible because there's just too many cards. There's too many different variables for them to keep track of in order to know where a format might end up or what interactions might end up being broken. So I think once you've sort of moved into this more reactive design philosophy, it's easier for you to fall into this trap where you say, okay, well, let's just make exciting cards. If there's a problem with how powerful or exciting they are, we'll get, we need players to be excited about the card when it comes out, and then we'll deal with that if it becomes enough of a problem later. And I think you're sort of pushing the consequences of your design decisions down the road to the point where everything looks hunky-dory until it doesn't. I think this also leads to this scenario where it feels like Wizards is sort of one step behind the ban cycle. It's like there's, a ban is made and then a broken deck emerges. This is a cycle that happened just in Standard, right? We had a ban for Mono Red because it was the top deck of the format. That goes away, and then VV Cauldron is right there to pick up exactly where it left off and become the most dominant deck in the format. And then it leads to another ban. I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen again. Maybe in this instance, they've found what the problem is and they're able to now be more proactive. But my guess is that because of the amount of cards that are just accessible in the Standard format now, it's entering that more like this is a eternal format, and it's nearly impossible to test all of the interactions and be proactive with the way that you design cards to make sure that they're going to fit into a meta. Why did Wizards choose to make Standard a 3-year format instead of a 2-year format? Previously, the rotation would happen every 2 years. Now it happens every 3. And also, what may have led Wizards to making these decisions that they need to make more powerful cards than what they would have previously. And part of that is just a little bit how card games work. Power creep is kind of inevitable especially if you're operating with an eternal format mindset, where the cards that you print have to be enticing to the people who are playing the game. And if those people have access to all the other cards that were ever previously printed, you're competing with all those other cards to make sure that people want to buy the new cards. The dichotomy between Standard here used to be that you'd have a lightning bolt format or you'd have a shock format. And that means that the cards that were coming out were either at a similar power level to lightning bolt, or they were at a similar power level to shock. The games tend to end a turn sooner in a lightning bolt format versus a shock format. I think it's difficult for us not to acknowledge the elephant in the room of the situation, though, and it's that Commander has become the most popular way to play Magic the Gathering. And Commander has a few challenges if you're designing cards for it alongside a standard format. As I mentioned previously, eternal formats put this kind of a pressure on the game and make it so that you're sort of printing cards that need to be as powerful as all of the other cards that have ever been printed. But the other sort of hiccup, one of the other, I think the other hiccup that I think is relevant to this particular idea is the idea that it's a singleton format. And I think the issue there is that when you're designing for a singleton format, it's very difficult for you to rely on the fact that a player can get two cards together in combination in play to create some kind of interesting play pattern, value engine, whatever that thing is that you want to do. And instead, you have to build that into a single card, right? The card has to be both the enabler and the payoff. We've been seeing this time and time again where we end up with these individual cards that are almost, they do everything. They're one card win conditions. Like VV is a perfect example. Tamio is another example. I'd argue Kaido also sort of falls in that category. The One Ring. There's several other of these cards that even still exist in the formats, and whether or not they'll get banned, I don't know. But I think they definitely fall in this category of they're cards that do not require another card to do the thing. So I think those are the sort of forces that are being put upon the design team to make the decisions that they have. But there's another force too that I think is almost outside of what's going on at Magic, and that's that player attention spans are different now. This has a variety of reasons. The biggest might be social media. You know, we see the short attention span design philosophy influencing a lot of game design, and I think most notably Marvel Snap falls perfectly into this category, where the game has been designed to be played in 6 turns. Like, it literally ends in 6 turns. And your deck of cards is very small. It's designed to do one very specific thing, and then there's some variance with the battlefields that are in play. Its design is extremely focused on making sure that players can play it in a short period of time on their phone, and that it is competing with somebody just browsing social media, right? If they're standing in line somewhere, or, you know, killing some time riding the bus or whatever they're doing. Okay, so those are probably the forces, or at least some of them, that have been put on the Wizards design team to sort of make the decision that they have that have led to these one card win conditions. So next, I think we need to talk about the consequences of the one card win conditions, and like where we are because of that. What is the outcome of making the card both the enabler and the payoff? There's sort of 2 things that I want to touch on here. One is that there's a lack of counterplay, which means that there's not a lot of back and forth. If a game is a meaningful decision with an uncertain outcome and measurable results, you'll repeat that loop multiple times throughout any given game of Magic, theoretically. When really powerful cards are printed and the number of subgames is reduced, it puts more and more pressure on each individual subgame, and the winner of those subgames becomes more advantaged in the game in its totality. And what we keep seeing emerge with these sort of one card win conditions is that if you can't, if you don't have it, you can't stop that card, then you just win the game. The player who played the card inevitably just wins. Whether or not they win in that exact moment, it's that they accrue so much advantage that they effectively have won the game without the game being over. So what are the consequences of that, right? We start to look down the line of, all right, well, if the game comes down to a single sub game, the force that puts on the players then is that, well, if I'm the player who's playing answers and I'm trying to stop my opponent from winning the game, and if I succeed and win that sub game, the game continues. I don't necessarily win the game. It's that the game gets to keep going. If I lose that sub game, the game ends. I lose. You end up in the situation where it's more advantageous to players to be the ones presenting these resilient, consistent threats to win the game instead of being the person trying to stop it. It basically comes down to whichever player can land the powerful thing first, and usually that is advantage to the person who goes first. So then you end up putting a lot more emphasis on the coin flip, like who gets to start playing the game first. There's actually 3 different decks that I want to look at to sort of illustrate my point. And these are all kind of like Reanimator variants. The initial one that I want to look at is one that's from, I think, around 2000, 5, which is called Greater Gifts. And then I want to look at Modern Goryo's Vengeance, and then I want to look at Legacy Reanimator. And so we can see the impact that these design decisions, these one-card win conditions, has had on Magic over time. So the initial deck to look at here is Greater Gifts. This is a very successful standard tournament deck from around 2005, which basically its engine was playing the Kamigawa Dragons, the card Greater Good, and then you're playing Goryo's Vengeance. And it also plays Gifts Ungiven, which is where the name of the deck comes from. And effectively what you do is you set up a very powerful value engine where you're able to ramp up to the point where you can play the Kamigawa Dragons. You're playing them, you sacrifice them to Greater Good to draw cards. They're in your graveyard now. Now you can get them back with Goryo's Vengeance. You can sacrifice them again to draw more cards. You can repeat this process to sort of overwhelm your opponent with value. The other thing that's interesting about this particular deck is it is a bit of a ramp deck. This is, I think, at baseline an economy strategy that plays a bit of interaction in board wipes. So let me explain real quick about what I mean by economy. The way that we sort of see any given strategy game that has resource management is through this thing that's called the strategy circle. It consists of rush, economy, and defense. And I would think of this as the most zoomed out view in like how you can spend resources in a strategic resource management game. Rush is attempting to win the game now. Economy is investing to win the game later. Defense is stopping your opponent from winning the game. So I would place Greater Gifts pretty firmly in the economy section on the strategy circle, with maybe a bit more towards defense, because it plays a lot of those board wipes to try to survive the early game, getting to the late game, so that they can overwhelm their opponent with value eventually. The other thing that it does is play some of the ramp pieces. One of the best ramp pieces at the time was Sakura Tribe Elder, and this allows them to block early game, sacrifice, and then get a land so that they are ramping themselves while they're able to stall a rush opponent from being able to beat them. So if you look at the strategy circle, rush beats economy, theoretically. And so that's one way for them to sort of shore up that they don't lose the game before they're able to establish their value engine. So next, I think we need to look at Modern Goryo's Vengeance. The comparison between these two decks is fascinating because we can see how over time, because the individual cards have gotten so much better, you're able to remove pieces of the synergy package from the deck. So the deck doesn't need to play Greater Good anymore. We now can just play Atraxa, because when Atraxa comes into play, unlike the Kamigawa Dragons, she draws you a bunch of cards anyway. So she's almost playing double duty here, right? She's your threat that you're reanimating back to the battlefield, and also you're able to just draw cards without needing to have another piece of synergy. And so what that does is it opens up room in the deck for the deck to be able to pivot towards other plans, potentially. It plays Psychic Frog. Psychic Frog is one of the best, I think maybe one of the best ever printed Reanimator sort of synergy pieces, where it acts as a discard outlet, but in a pinch, it also becomes one of your win conditions, right? It can attack it can basically play a tempo game. And this is what led to it being banned in Legacy, not banned in Modern. Because we're able to sort of pivot to this more tempo strategy if we need to, where we can kind of compete with decks that are trying to beat us quickly, we don't need to run those board wipes anymore, because we don't want to take out our own tempo pieces like Psychic Frog. Because your game plan can kind of come online so much earlier, you don't need to sort of stall the game out to get to those later turns to overwhelm your opponent with value. You're doing it in those early turns, right? Atraxa also lifelink. So an aggro deck trying to take you out early, rush strategy that's supposed to be able to undercut you as an economy strategy, doesn't matter, right? You gain the life back as long as you can get Atraxa in play and attack with her at some point in the game before you're dead to something like Mono Red. I think it's also really interesting for a moment, I want to linger on Psychic Frog, where if we compare Psychic Frog's role in a Reanimator deck to the cards that used to fill that role, the one from way back in the day is Putrid Imp, which is a 1-mana 1/1 that you can discard a card to give it flying. It also has Threshold to give it another +1/+1. I also think it can't block. I don't know. This card's not good, right? But you're basically just playing it because you can get it into play early to discard the thing that you're going to reanimate and then reanimate it into play. So I think what's also important here is to understand that combinations of cards are what create unique play patterns. It's the way that multiple cards interact together to make the gameplay feel different for any given strategy. In Greater Gifts case, we have this interesting interaction between getting all of these pieces online, which is your Kamigawa Dragons, your Greater Good, your Glorious Vengeance, and all of these things work together in an interesting way. But if you don't have one of the pieces of them, you've been presented with a suboptimal situation where you might not have all the pieces that complete your value engine. And so it puts you into this position where you as a player need to sort of strategically figure out what you're going to do because you don't have all those pieces. It also provides counterplay because your opponents have different angles of attacking your value engine. And with something like Atraxa or whatever, that thing's already in play and has already gotten the advantage. Where if you needed to play Greater Good one turn and then you couldn't play a dragon to sacrifice until the next turn, that Greater Good is there for your opponent to interact with before you've inherently just already gotten the value out of it. You have multiple different angles of attack when you're looking at something like this Greater Gifts deck that you don't have in a modern Reanimator deck. It's basically, do you have the counterspell to stop me from reanimating Atraxa? If you don't, you basically have lost the game. Again, it's that one sub-game defines the game. The other thing that we're seeing here is that because you don't have to devote all of your deck to one particular game plan, decks start to feel pretty mushy, right? They feel like they could be a tempo deck or they could be a Reanimator deck instead of like, this is a Reanimator deck. This deck does one thing, one play pattern, and it's defined by that play pattern, which means the other play patterns can be defined by other decks, which means you have multiple decks in the format that are viable. Okay, so let's talk about Legacy for a minute because we need to get to Legacy Reanimator. I feel like it's a little bit of a bummer that Entomb is the card that is basically is the thing that has to pay for the current design philosophy that Wizards has pursued of creating these individual cards that are extremely powerful. Don't get me wrong, Entomb is a really powerful card, and it is a very it itself is an enabler, right? It's not a card that is both an enabler and a payoff. It's an enabler alongside Reanimate, which is also an enabler, which then gets you to Atraxa. If we want to think critically about Entomb for a minute, I think its biggest issue is that it's so compact, right? It is Entomb Reanimate being just 2 mana effectively means that maybe turn 1 you can Thoughtseize, and then turn 2 you can Entomb Reanimate. It's also instant speed. You can entomb something at the end of your opponent's turn, and it sort of, again, shrinks that window of interaction for your opponent. The other thing it allows you to do is not have to play multiple copies of your payoffs, right? You can play a single copy of Atraxa, a single copy of Archon of Cruelty, and then you can just use Entomb to go get them. And so this creates extra room in your deck for you to be able to play these other strategies that you can pivot to if your opponent happens to be playing the thing that will beat you. If they're playing a lot of Graveyard Hate, you can pivot to a tempo plan. If they're able to sort of interact with your smaller creatures, then if they're able to stop your Tameo, they can use Pithing Needle or whatever to stop your Tameo plan. You still have the Reanimator plan as your backup. So I think if we look at the Reanimator deck, we kind of have to ask ourselves what the real problem with the deck is. Is the problem the Reanimator package, or is the problem that they can pivot to these other strategies so easily because the other cards are such a one card win condition? The guys on the Eternal Glory podcast basically identified Tameo and the One Ring as like their 2 most worthy of ban cards, and I think this is the reason why. Is that if you sort of play, like, if you look at Reanimator's ability to pivot, I think Tameo is such a big part of that if you banned Tameo, then theoretically Reanimator might still be able to exist, but would not be able to pivot so easily to more of a tempo game plan. I think maybe Wizards of the Coast took the route of just going ahead and getting rid of Entomb because that package is also so small and so powerful that maybe they're thinking, okay, we're going to continue to print these 1-card win conditions, and Entomb Reanimate is just so strong. If we alongside any other like large powerful creature we would print, that it's subverting the ability for us to cost things correctly with mana, that maybe Reanimation at that level in Legacy is just not, it's just too strong, right? It's too compact of a very powerful interaction that we're going to go ahead and hit that instead of continuing to try to play whack-a-mole with these other sort of 1-card win conditions that we're going to continue to make. I'm just speculating, though. I don't know for sure. They didn't really touch on Tameo at all in the ban and restricted announcement. I kind of wish they would, but I do think down the road Tamiyo is going to be in the spotlight. So with the one card win condition sort of pivot, the thing that we're left with is that it's very easy for you to pivot when your opponent brings something that theoretically can beat you, right? It's like, okay, well, they sideboarded for their Reanimator plan, but suddenly you're a tempo deck, or your Reanimator plan just works anyway, those kinds of things. And effectively, because you're able to occupy more space on the strategy circle than you should be able to, because you can move between strategies in that way, it makes it very difficult for them to select something that's going to beat you at any given moment. If you're an economy strategy and their goal should be rush, right? They want to beat you before your economy engine can get online and get going, and you see that happening, you can then pivot to more of a defensive or tempo strategy to sort of disrupt their rush strategy and beat them anyway. That's effectively what we're seeing happen. Hopefully with these sort of 3 Reanimator examples, we can kind of see how over time Wizards, the printing of these powerful one card win conditions has reduced the amount of space that any given strategy takes up in a deck and allows decks to pivot easier. It's difficult, the situation that R&D has put themselves in, because they don't have the ability for things to rotate the way that they're supposed to. There's also, the 3-card standard means, 3-year standard means that they're going to have a harder time testing decks to make sure that these overpowered interactions don't occur. I do think generally, though, the course of action moving forward might be to split these things up into different cards. But then again, if everybody's playing Commander, you can't really split those cards up that way because you're playing one copy of these things, which means that you can't rely on having multiple cards together in play to get that value. So yeah, I don't know. I think that the lessons here for me anyway is that I think singleton formats aren't great. I think that we down the road here, we've kind of seen that it puts forces on design that are antithetical towards what I think to sort of maintaining the strategy circle, right? Like if you're playing both if you're putting both enabler and payoff on the same card, I think that it makes sense in a singleton format. And maybe it's fine there. Maybe the fact that it does everything there isn't nearly as big of a deal, and like strategies can get online. But I do think that I don't know if you can thread the needle. I don't know if you can thread the needle between having singleton formats and also having 4 copies of a card, 60 card formats. I think those two things can't coexist. That's the thing I'm most concerned about. But yeah, let me know your thoughts. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye.